Good evening. You're on the smoking section. My name is Steve Helfer. This is not my mug shot, but the phone number if anybody wants to call tonight, because it can't come on the screen. And I invite your calls either to agree or disagree with me. Always fun talking to you, especially one of my very, very loyal customers, Jim. I haven't heard from you for a few weeks. And Paul Neff is sometimes calls up, and I certainly welcome you. Today we got something on Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights Facebook page, which is an ordinance that Mayor Walsh is suggesting to the City Council in Boston regarding what are called sandwich boards, which businesses put outside on the street or on the sidewalk. And evidently this is something that's caught his attention, and he wants to further regulate them. I don't think there really is too much regulation on them in the city of Boston. But what Mayor Walsh wants to do is, some of it sounds quite reasonable. He wants to determine a particular size and a placement for them, and also to have the phone number of the business on them, and that kind of stuff, which of course is important to have because you don't want them impeding pedestrian traffic. But one thing that he does, there are two things he does that kind of border on issues that our First Amendment covers. And one of those is that you can advertise anything you want as long as you sell it in the store. Now that would sound like it could preclude what evidently are snarky comments that are put on these boards sometimes by store owners like Free Tom Brady or stuff like that. And that's where Mayor Walsh is getting into First Amendment problems, because while you can decide certain things such as size, etc., to actually tell a store owner what kind of content to put on these, again, is a First Amendment issue. And then also Mayor Walsh is saying you cannot advertise tobacco products on these things. I don't know what his position is on e-cigarettes, but for example, in Davis Square, Somerville, there is a sandwich board advertising e-cigarettes for a vape shop. But this again is a First Amendment issue, because a lot of people think that the First Amendment only applies to religious speech or political speech, but in point of fact, it also applies to commercial speech, but not as rigorously. So for example, there was a period of time where many states, maybe all states, forbade doctors from advertising. Doctors were not allowed to advertise. And that may have gone up in front of the Supreme Court of the United States, and the Supreme Court struck that down and said, well, why is it that doctors can't advertise? That is a First Amendment right. In addition to that, as I've mentioned before on this show, the FDA wanted cigarette companies to put what are called graphic images on cigarette packages, and these are images that are meant to elicit repulsion, make terrible, terrible looking teeth and this kind of thing on cigarette packs. And the cigarette companies said, well, this is what's called compelled speech, and it is again considered part of the First Amendment that the government has limits on what it can compel us to say. And according to American jurisprudence at least, the government can require, for example, warning labels on packages that are meant to inform the customer or the consumer, but the government cannot demand that a private company put on its packaging a message, a government message that is meant to repel the consumer from that particular product. So the Justice Department of the federal government right now dropped the case because the cigarette companies got a favorable decision in a federal court. So now Mayor Walsh, who has become very, very anti-smoking and anti-tobacco, says, well, you can advertise this, but you can't advertise that. And of course, it becomes a slippery slope. You can't advertise soft drinks, or maybe you can't advertise hamburgers. You can't advertise the size of your soft drinks. I mean, at what point does the government lose its ability to restrict freedom of speech, and in this case, commercial speech? So I think he is treading on thin ice here, although, as a matter of fact, considering that I have almost never seen a sandwich board advertising tobacco products in the city of Boston, as usual, it seems like overkill. And, I was interested because one of the things that tobacco does, of course, is help people control their weight. And I looked at a photograph of Mayor Walsh, about 15 years ago, and he was actually a thin man, and now he is quite chubby. And I mean, he really, I think, is setting a very bad example for the youth of the city. I mean, if he can't control his weight, be it through diet or exercise, maybe he shouldn't be the mayor, because after all, we have a big obesity problem in the country. And if we are going to tell baseball players, as Mayor Walsh did, that they can't chew tobacco in Fenway Park simply because it might be set a bad example for children, then maybe Mayor Walsh, who is having a weight problem and appears unable to deal with it, really shouldn't be the mayor of the city. Of course, Mayor Menino, who was a very, very ardent and ruthless, I would say, anti-smoking person, he, of course, had a terrible weight problem all his life, may have been healthier, actually, if he had used tobacco products. But this freedom of speech is an important thing, and it's important, particularly in terms of commercial speech, because while everybody says, well, our religious speech, our political speech is protected, businesses, of course, which are the ones that provide us with all the products we get and provide millions upon millions of Americans with jobs, and provide a huge amount of the taxes that the government uses to provide services, they also have rights. And I think that this is going over the line for Walsh. I don't think tobacco should be forbidden to be advertised on these sandwich boards, and I hope that the ACLU or that other free speech advocates will trim this from the regulations. The point, I don't think, is a terribly important point, because, as I say, I have never seen a sandwich board with those with advertising tobacco. But another free speech issue that I hope was covered on our Facebook page, and that will, I hope, go to the courts, and that the tobacco companies, in this case R.J. Reynolds, will prevail, is that the FDA is telling the American Spirit Tobacco Company, cigarette company, that they can no longer write on their packages, this cigarette is additive free and organic. Even though the FDA says that this is accurate information, this is really incredible. The FDA does not dispute the accuracy of this information that this cigarette company is trying to disseminate, but it is saying that consumers might get the impression that the cigarette is safer because it is additive free and organic, which actually leads into another one of the big lies of the anti-smoking movement, because for 20 years at least, they used to accuse the companies of adding what the anti-smokers call a potpourri of dangerous chemicals to cigarettes. And the implication there is thereby making the cigarettes less safe. So now, when the tobacco companies, or in this case American Spirit, is indeed putting no additives in the cigarettes, then the anti-smoking reformers are now saying, well, it doesn't make any difference if you put additives in or you don't put additives in. So, as always, the anti-smoking reformers are completely unprincipled in their war, not only against tobacco companies and tobacco, but against us smokers. They have no principles whatsoever, and they have the nerve to accuse the tobacco companies of lying when anti-smoking groups have lied far more than tobacco companies ever have. I was disappointed because someone from the American Council on Science and Health, which is actually a pretty balanced organization in New York, he said that he thought that the FDA was right, that consumers might get the impression, even though on the package it is required for them to say that because it is additive free and because it is organic does not mean it's safer. That is on the package. But they can't even say it's organic and additive free. But the American Council on Science and Health has said that they agree with the FDA because presumably consumers might get the impression it's a safer cigarette. But the problem I have with that is there any evidence that the American Council on Science and Health could proffer to show that by reducing additives and making it organic, that it in fact is not safer? It seems to me I don't think there has ever been a study that has compared, for example, cigarettes with additives and non-organic tobacco with cigarettes with no additives and organic tobacco. In fact, I'm sure there has never been such a study, which of course would take at least 20 or 30 years to effect, because even the strongest anti-smoking zealots usually acknowledge that any kind of risk that one gets from smoking tobacco is only incurred after about 40 or more years of use. So it seems to me, in this case, the American Council on Science and Health is saying something which there is absolutely no evidence to support them. And if they are going to restrict R.J. Reynolds, or in this case American Spirits, from writing something that is accurate and truthful on their packages, the American Council on Science and Health should have some strong evidence that is not the case, that a organic additive-free cigarette is not in fact safer. But certainly when it comes to tobacco products, free speech is something that we have seen abrogated many times. What some people don't realize, and as a matter of fact I'm not perfectly sure of, is since about 1970 cigarette companies have not advertised on television. But I don't think that in fact that is a government regulation, because I think that would violate First Amendment. I think that tobacco companies have decided to, or I think they did decide voluntarily to withdraw advertising from television and radio. I don't think there is an actual congressional law against it. If anybody knows the answer to that, I would be most interested in finding out. But for example, hard liquor is not advertised on television, and they advertise beer and wine, but they do not advertise scotch and whiskey, at least not on network television. And a few years back, I would say about 10 years ago, one of the alcohol companies was going to start advertising hard liquor on television, but decided against it. But again, that is not a law, because again, there are First Amendment rights there. So the companies, the beverage companies, have decided voluntarily not to put ads for hard liquor on television, but again, it's not a law. So it's unfortunate that Mayor Walsh, whom Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights thought was not going to be another Menino in terms of tobacco, God rest his soul, Mayor Menino, by the way, is now really going after tobacco. And as we all know, he banned professional ball players from using smokeless tobacco in Fenway Park, mostly on the grounds that it would set a bad example for teenagers. Now, people think that using smokeless tobacco really heightens the risk for cancers of the head, the mouth, throat, etc. But the only study that I've seen that really covered baseball players, which was done in 1988, and which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, so it's therefore one of these peer-reviewed studies and everything, not only found that even though a third of baseball players at that time used smokeless tobacco, chewing tobacco and the like, they did not die of illnesses said to be caused by tobacco at a higher rate than the general public, and that in fact they actually lived longer lives. So why do we get this impression that chewing tobacco causes mouth cancer, etc., other than the fact that the medical authorities say it does? Well, one reason is because even though hundreds and thousands, I suppose, of baseball players have used chewing tobacco, if one develops, unfortunately, any kind of problem with the mouth cancer of that sort, it immediately is publicized to the hilt. But if someone who doesn't use chewing tobacco unfortunately gets that illness, you don't hear about it so much. So every time a baseball player gets this, even though it's pretty rare in baseball, it is always given a lot of publicity, so one might get the impression that baseball players are dying, are getting sick in this way, when the most definitive study done on them, again published in 1988 in the New England Journal of Medicine, found the opposite to be the truth. And then this whole business about we got to set a good example for children, we curtail the freedoms of adults simply because they might be setting a bad example, is really, I would say, very specious and very much a slippery slope. I mean, each day on television and the internet, teenagers and young people are exposed to a steady diet of bone-crushing sports where they could break their neck or get a terrible concussion or even be killed. They're exposed to hair-raising car races on television, the internet, where people drive and face immediate death or death to people that they hit in these cars. And not to mention the non-stop violence on television and the internet, the drug abuse, the sexual promiscuity, all of these things, or at least some of these things, which could cause immediate death to a teenager, whereas chewing tobacco, even if you believe the anti-smoking reformers, only gets problematic after 30 or 40 years, and you're not risking death. I mean, as a matter of fact, in the history of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to my knowledge, no one has ever overdosed on tobacco or nicotine and died therefrom. That is in the history, and tobacco has been used in Massachusetts since the 1600s. So if we were talking about acute danger, tobacco and nicotine pose no acute danger, except possibly fire danger, but there's so many other things that cause fires in the Commonwealth. The most common cause of fires in the Commonwealth are electrical appliances. And even though some people say that cigarettes do pose a fire danger, all cigarettes sold in the Commonwealth now are what are called fire-safer cigarettes, so that if you drop it on a bedspread or you drop it in a, let's say a pile of leaves or something like that, it will extinguish itself. These are self-extinguishing, so they extinguish themselves before they can ignite a fire, because a certain amount of time is necessary to ignite a fire. So the acute danger from cigarettes has really been nullified, and it is also well known in the firefighting profession that a lot of times if a fire department cannot determine the causes of fire, they'll just simply blame it on the careless disposal of smoking materials, even when there isn't a lot of evidence to point to that. So that is where Mayor Walsh is taking the city of Boston. Nothing about personal liberty, nothing about respect for the First Amendment, and also just a great expansion of the power of government without any respect for personal liberty, and again, the First Amendment. If anyone is watching and would like to give us a call here, give me a call, I guess that's the royal me. This is the number. We will be moving to a new studio shortly, I guess either my next program or the program after that, in which case the number will be up. But as always, I welcome your calls. Now, someone was talking to me today, and he said, well, he liked to smoke, but we both had to acknowledge that if we didn't smoke, we would be better off. And I think that's a simplistic question for that. I don't think that most Americans would necessarily be in better health if they didn't smoke. Or I certainly don't think I myself might be in better health if I didn't smoke. I just don't know. Because I do know that smoking has helped me at times when I was depressed or lonely or anxious, and helped me concentrate during times of my life. I think it helped me keep my weight under control at times of my life where I tended to be overweight. And it was also a great pleasure, and it was a pleasure that was a very reliable pleasure. So all of these things combined over the course of my life, I don't know what I would be like without that. Now maybe I would be infinitely healthier, or maybe I would be infinitely happier. But I tend to doubt that. I think for many people, tobacco helps them cope with life. And one piece of evidence I would use for the opposite is that as smoking rates have declined in the United States in the last 30 or 40 years, the number of Americans who are taking psychotropic medication has increased many-fold. And not only that, but the number of Americans who, because of mental disabilities, are unable to work has also increased at the same time as the rate of smoking has decreased. Is there a connection? I think there is. I don't know. I certainly am not blaming the increase in psychoactive medication entirely on the fact that cigarette smoking has declined. But I think pervasive cigarette smoking, as there was as recently as, let's say, 20 years ago, enabled a lot of people to cope with many, many situations without having to resort to pharmaceuticals. I think it brought pleasure to many people in many different circumstances which they no longer have. I think this has led to a society that is increasingly getting uptight, is increasingly finding it difficult to socialize, and is increasingly relying on psychoactive medication to cope. And again, an increasing number of people are crossing over that line where their mental difficulties are making it impossible for them to work. Who knows? Maybe if the rate of smoking had not declined so much in the last 20 or 30 years, I would not have to say that. We had a problem today in the square where we had a very aggressive person came up to our table and really started shouting and misbehaving. So I wanted to thank the unofficial mayor of Harvard Square, Bob Marshall, and a man named Steve Callahan, who immediately came over and settled this miscreant down. I wanted to thank them very much, and I also wanted to thank a young woman named Derenique, who was very nice to sign our petition. Thanks for watching the smoking section. Please tune in next week.